Shall we start now, Archibald?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, up to you. You are the chair.
Okay, yeah.
So you are in charge.
All right. Hello, everyone. As you know, we are in a different time zones. So I would say good morning to colleagues in the US and good afternoon to colleagues in Europe and good night to the Australian colleague. Maybe Greg, just before he joined us, but we had the different we got confused about time difference, so he would come join later. First of all, I would like to express my deep appreciation to you all for your presence in this conference. Especially, I would like to thank Dr. Marvin Sweeney and Joachim Sweeney, who are joining very early morning in the US. And then, so I'm very appreciate your participation. As Archibald and I informed earlier, we are working on the volume entitled The Function of the Reader in the Formation and the Reception in the Book of Isaiah. You are all invited to contribute to this intended volume. We thank you all again for your acceptance and participation for this project. Archibald and I are so excited to have this opportunity to share our first thought in this conference. And we look forward to your presentation today and tomorrow. Before beginning our first session, now I would like to begin our first session with Dr. Archibald van Wieringen. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Archibald van Wieringen?
Sehoon, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Dear friends, I feel very honored to be the first to speak, and in doing so to be able to present some of my primary thoughts on the role of the reader in the formation and reception of the book of Isaiah. The title of my paper is Fortschreibung, or Reader's Response, ? I forgot the question mark on the flyer. I hope to find an answer to this question in this presentation. Looking at the history of the exegesis of the book of Isaiah, we see that its focus used to be mainly on the historical author. This focus might be understandable from the fact that Old Testament exegesis as a modern critical science arose in the 16th, 17th century with the question whether Moses was the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. Parallel to this question, the research question for the book of Isaiah was whether Isaiah was the author of the book named after him. We all know the answer that was formulated particularly from the 19th century onwards. Exegetes split the book of Isaiah into 3. The chapters 1 to 39, the first Isaiah, were considered to be written by the historical prophet Isaiah, although with many additions from later times. The chapters 40 to 55 were attributed to an unknown author, whom we call the second Isaiah. And finally, the chapters 56 to 66 were ascribed to another unknown author, the so-called third Isaiah. Originally, these 3 Isaiahs were 3 independent historical authors, as especially Bernard Doom has made clear. In this view, the book of Isaiah consists of 3 separate parts tied together only by putting a ribbon around these parts, bundling these 3 parts into one biblical book. Although after Doom, the focus remained on the author, the idea of 3 separate books was adhered to less and less. Instead of the classical idea of a first, second, and third Isaiah, the idea of Fortschreibung was introduced. To my knowledge, Ulrich Berkes was the first to fully use this concept. In Berkes' view, the book of Isaiah is like a cathedral that has been built onto for centuries. The architectural style changed over the centuries, but the building process continued, resulting in a magnificent cathedral that gives the visitor of the cathedral a harmonious feeling of coherence. In contrast to Doom's view, the idea of the Fortschreibung sees the book of Isaiah as not containing two hard and ugly seams between three separate original books, but as forming a coherent whole consisting of texts written by authors from various times. However, the contrast between Fortschreibung and Doom's three separate books is much greater than that. The concept of Fortschreibung implies a writing activity based upon already written texts. Fortschreibung is not about authors' activities as such, as if these authors would have been started up over, but about authors' activities in reaction to already written texts. This means that the authors of the Fortschreibung were readers of the already written text as well. Or more precisely, they were readers first. The question that forms the title of this talk of mine, Fortschreibung or Reader's Response, is a false question. It is not either or, but both and. In the formation of the book of Isaiah, the reader becomes an author, and being such a type of new author is only possible if he or she is also a reader. Mutatis mutandis, the same applies to the concept of the book of Isaiah resulting in new texts, for instance, the New Testament texts. In fact, the situation is even more complex. A person that becomes an author due to his reading activities becomes an author due to his relationship with the text-immanent reader of the text he has read. Every text contains a text-immanent author and a text-immanent reader. It means the author present in the text and the reader present in the text. We have to make this distinction between historical author and text-immanent author to avoid an identification of the historical producer of a text and the inner textual author's position in a text. Simply said, the text does not give us direct access to the mind of the historical author. The same applies to the text-immanent reader. The text-immanent author manipulates its reader in the text to maneuver this reader into a certain position. Perhaps a historical reader will not let himself be manipulated. Therefore, we need this distinction between historical reader and text-immanent reader. So for the book of Isaiah, this means that the person writing new texts based upon reading already existing texts relates himself to the text-immanent reader of these already existing texts. Applied to the formation of the book of Isaiah, this is not easy. You might be able to know in general which are the already written texts and which are the newly written texts, but we will never exactly know the literal form of these older texts. We know them only by reconstruction as a hypothesis. Take, for example, the Emmanuel in Isaiah 7:1-17. I think that the author of the text about the servant of the Lord was inspired by reading the Emmanuel texts. But was the text this reader read exactly identical to the text of Isaiah 7:1-17, as we can now find it in our text critical edition of the Hebrew Bible? Certainly, it must have been approximately the same text, but that is not the same as being exactly the same text. Applied to the reception of the book of Isaiah, this is less difficult, although we still face problems. Matthew 1:18b-25 forms a reception of the Emmanuel text found in the book of Isaiah. This means that the historical author has a relationship with the text immanent reader of the Isaiah Emmanuel text. But what exactly is the text he read? Our Masoretic Hebrew text, or the Greek text of the Septuagint, or maybe some other version, or maybe even a combination of versions? The author of the new text, reading the existing texts, has a relationship with the text immanent reader of the existing text. This does not mean that this author exactly takes the position of the text immanent reader of the text he has read. In my view, the Isaiah Emmanuel text manipulates the text immanent reader to be aware of the continuation of the Davidic house even beyond the failing kings. But in the figure of the servant of the Lord in the chapters 40 to 66, this Davidic house is not present as a royal dynasty, although the focus is still on an ideal leader given by God. This means that in his capacity as the reader of the already existing texts, the author of the new text has only used the ideal leader aspect of the Emmanuel, leaving out a monarchy. For the reception of the Isaiah Emmanuel text by Matthew, I think that the emphasis is on naming the child to be born. Although Matthew does not have a political system of a monarchy as such in mind, he nevertheless reuses the royal title of king for the child, whereas the servant of the Lord is not called king anywhere in the book of Isaiah. A scope of 10 minutes does not offer me the time to elaborate on these examples, but I hope to do so for our volume. I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Okay.
And then would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Marvin Sweeney? Yeah.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you both Sehoon and Archibald for the invitation. I, of course, have already finished my commentaries on Isaiah years ago, but I'm still engaged with the book, although my head's more into Samuel and Jeremiah these days. But I find myself both asked and compelled to write on Isaiah continuously, which I did for my dissertation now nearly 40 years ago. My understanding is that we have 10 minutes to speak, not 20. Okay, so I'm going to have to wing this. There's no way I can read my paper, so I'll just discuss the main points off the cuff, if you will. But my interest in the topic that I've laid out lies in two major concepts. One is what is meant by Berit Olam, which we frequently understand as eternal covenant, and what is meant by the presentation of that covenant when we look at the so-called metaphorical marriage relationship between God as husband and Bat Zion or Bat Yerushalayim as bride, particularly as it's laid out in Isaiah 54 and ancillary texts that are associated with that. Let me first say a few things about Berit Olam. We've come to understand Berit Olam as eternal covenant because of various texts in the Pentateuch, as well as in Isaiah and other texts. And yet there are some major theological difficulties or tensions with that term. For example, Isaiah 24, verse 5, you see a statement that says that the eternal covenant has been broken or abrogated, or however you might choose to translate the term there. And yet that raises a very problematic theological question. How is it that an eternal covenant can be broken? It defies the very meaning of the term. But when you look at not only the contents of the book of Isaiah and other writings, but also the semantic range of the terminology Berit Olam. Olam, oftentimes translated as eternal, also has a meaning of world, as in world of creation. And this is tied closely with the notion that a temple, whether it's the temple in Jerusalem or other ancient Near Eastern temples, such as the Entemenanki in Babylon, or the temple to Baal in Ugarit and others, are generally seen as holy centers of creation, in which part of the theological understanding of the temple is that the temple provides a foundation for stability or order, as well as sanctity in creation, which entails that if a temple is destroyed, creation itself is either destroyed or somehow impaired. And while when you look up the term olam in standard lexica, you'll see statements that this meaning of olam as world is a late understanding, 1st century BCE or so. In fact, you see it standing behind some texts that we see and oftentimes push aside. My earlier comments to Archibald, I'm thinking about now, such as Ezekiel 40 to 48, the new temple in Jerusalem or the heavens or wherever it might be, deals with impairment of creation and envisions a new creation. And yet we push that text aside because of efforts to try to configure Ezekiel as a prophet rather than a priest. And yet, as John Levinson's work has pointed out, Ezekiel 40 to 48 fits perfectly into the theological structure of Ezekiel as a priest. And within our own text, Isaiah 66, Trito Isaiah, will speak of a new heavens or a new earth, that is new creation, that would be joined with the concept of a rebuilding of a temple, which is not very explicitly addressed in the book of Isaiah. So that notion of eternal covenant, I think, has to be qualified with covenant of creation and all that that entails by the impairment or destruction of the temple, its reestablishment, and that the thinking that engenders concerning what is the status of creation now by the end of the book, when we see the prospects of Jerusalem restored. That's one point I'd like to make. Second point I'd like to make is in reading Isaiah 7 and 8, part of the so-called Denkschrift or memoir that we so frequently used in thinking about Isaiah, and yet there's very clear indication that Isaiah 6 through 9 verse 6, or wherever you might conclude the so-called Denkschrift, is not a unified composition, at least historically speaking, even though we've tried to configure it as such. Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 8 are written in first person perspective, whereas Isaiah 7 is written in third person perspective, already pointing to a change of historical author and perhaps also implied author or whatever terminology we might use. But we focused more on Isaiah 7. Christian theologians love Emmanuel and the notion of a virgin as the possible mother for the son to be born. But we tend to neglect Isaiah 8. And here we see some very disturbing imagery written in first person form, which describes the Assyrian monarch spreading his wings over the land that then results in a flood in the land that then brings about the land's impairment, destruction, or desanctification, if you will. In observing this language, spreading the wings has oftentimes been understood in relation to divine creatures or what have you. But bear in mind that spreading the wings also refers to spreading one's garment in relation to sexual activity. Boaz and Ruth in the book of Ruth, when Boaz spreads his garment over Ruth, that's understood metaphorically as consummation of a marriage, if you will. And yet when we see this language in Isaiah, we don't even think about Ruth, but what we're looking at is imagery of rape, in which the Assyrian monarch invades and attacks the land configured as woman, and metaphorically rapes her during the course of invasion. What then does that mean for understanding the role of God, who is protector of Jerusalem and Judah in the book of Isaiah? This then takes us later in the book to Isaiah 54, understanding well the differences in historical author, but using our implied author or imminent author, if you will, to understand the synchronic dimensions of the book of Isaiah, in which we see God or the prophet announcing to Bat-Sion or Yerushalayim that her worries are over, that her husband God is now returning, and that her children are also returning to her. And yet, when we read Isaiah 54, we see God's statements, well, I was only gone for a little while. That's a very important statement, because one has to ask, where were you, God, during your absence? And what happened to your metaphorical bride during that period of absence? One might ask, and some might consider this blasphemous, but was God having a relationship with other women? Astarte, Ishtar, Hathor? But that's a question that has to be asked, and not facetiously, but where was God? Which is a question in the book of Isaiah. As you know, check Isaiah 8, verse 16 and following, God hiding the divine face from Jacob. But in the second part of Isaiah, not only do we have Isaiah 54 stating, I was only gone for a little while, but you've got text in Isaiah 51 and 52 addressed to Bat-Sion, Yerushalayim, telling her that no longer will the unclean and uncircumcised come into you. Again, sexual metaphor there, the language of rape, which means that God left Bat-Sion unprotected, and the imagery of rape then describes what happened to her in the course of divine absence. We then see the Berit Olam restored, Isaiah 55, in which you see the statements addressed to Israel. I will make with you a new covenant, a Berit Olam, like the sure fidelities of David once before. And in Isaiah 61, we see statements that the Berit Olam is about to be restored or reenacted in relation to Jerusalem, leading us to the end of the book, where it's not quite yet complete, because Isaiah ends with the picture of the corpses of the wicked scattered about at the end of chapter 66, which means that this question of reflection on what does it mean to have a Berit Olam remains yet unfinished and wide open for post-canonical, if you will, interpretation, as we'll see especially in the papers that are offered tomorrow.
All right. Thank you very much for Dr.
Thank
Marvin
you.
Sweeney. Yeah, thank you for your very stimulating your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, now we are going to move on to the third session. So I think Joachim Egg is ready for his presentation. So
yes, thank you for introducing me.
Yeah, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Joachim Egg?
Thank you. So you can download from the chat my translation of the text, and it's a German translation and also the English translation. And so you can follow using this text. In this short paper, I will first present a few insights and then raise some questions to be addressed based on my analysis of Isaiah 61, I will describe some elements concerning the structure and the various speech perspectives used. The emphasis will be on verses 1 to 4, and I hope to progress further in the course of my work on this paper, on this contribution. Isaiah 61 is generally considered as a part of a larger unit comprising chapters 60 to 62. The core theme of this book section is the restoration of Jerusalem. In chapter 60, a speech in second person singular feminine voice is addressed to Zion, which commands her to arise as her light has come. The speaker is the Lord himself, as he repeatedly speaks about himself in first person singular in this passage. He proclaims to Zion the turning of her fate. The time of darkness and misery is over. Instead, eternal peace and prosperity are announced. In chapter 61, verses 1 to 3a, a new and different voice is heard that speaks in first person singular. Ruach Adonai Elohim alai ya'an mashach Adonai oti. The Spirit of the Lord Adonai is upon me, for Adonai has anointed me. 1a. This speaker describes his commission by means of 7 infinitives, according to the Masoretic text. The first 3 announce works of spiritual charity to the benefit of the poor and oppressed. The next 4 infinitives state that a year of divine favor will turn the fate of those who mourn in Zion into its opposite. So instead of mourning, there will be joy. In verses 3b and 4, we find a new section characterized by a change in form. Now there is a voice that uses third person speech perspective and thus shifts into a descriptive style. It is left up to the reader to decide whether this means the speech of the Anointed One ends in verse 3a or not. In terms of content, verses 3b and 4 describe consequences of the activities of the Anointed One, which the preceding infinitives had depicted. So we have basically the commission expressed in infinitives and then the consequences. This is indicated by the use of 2 consecutive perfect verbs in 3b, v'kora, and 4a alpha, uvanu. In verse 4a beta, the imperfect yekomemu, they shall raise up, marks a new activity, followed by another consecutive perfect, v'chichu, they will renew or rebuild. Here the focus moves from the restoration of Zion to the reconstruction of the destroyed cities in the whole country. This may well be understood as another consequence of the work of the Anointed One, whose speech would then also comprise verses 3b through 4. Yet there are other signals in the text that propose the speech could end in verse 3b with a metaphor representing the inhabitants of Zion as a planting of oaks of justice. This planting belongs to the Lord and manifests his glory. See the form lehit pa'ir, in order to glorify. Here, both contents and vocabulary of the end of the preceding chapter 60 and there verse 21 are taken up. The Anointed One is thus characterized as the Lord's instrument to fulfill the preceding prophecy of salvation. Since Isaiah 60 is spoken to Zion and concludes with the announcement that her people will all be just and righteous, a sprout of the Lord's planting, it is consistent to assume that the subsequent speech of the Anointed One in chapter 61 also ends on the description of the people of God as a planting glorifying the Lord by their righteousness. We, as readers of Isaiah, have now seen three options where we could consider the Anointed One to have concluded his speech, either in verse 3a for formal reasons or in 3b for reasons of content and intertextuality, or in 4 for reasons of grammar. At the present stage of my deliberations, I would opt for the latter because the grammatical aspect that the consecutive perfect used in 3b continues into 4a is underscored by the observation that also verse 4 as a whole takes up important ideas and catchwords from the end of the preceding chapter. Since Zion was mentioned by name in 3a, the reconstruction of the ancient ruins announced in 4a can naturally be associated with her. This corresponds to the reconstruction of the walls of Zion already announced in 60 verse 10a, albeit with some modifications, as not only the walls but all ruins are rebuilt in 61 verse a, and not strangers as in 60 verse 10, but the inhabitants of Zion themselves do this work in 61 4a, whereas the strangers are degraded to serve as slaves in farming according to 61 verse 5. When 61 4b prophesies the rebuilding of the land and its cities, this takes up the ideas of chapter 60 verse 18, that devastation shall never occur anymore within the borders of the land pertaining to Zion, and of 60 verse 21, according to which the people of Zion shall possess the land forever. In the context of 61, verse 4 specifies that the people of Zion will rebuild both the capital herself as well as all other cities in the whole land that belongs to her. This positive development, which leads to the fulfillment of chapter 60, will be triggered by the charismatic work of the Anointed One. Endowed with the Spirit of the Lord, his care for the afflicted and imprisoned one who live in Zion will defeat all depression and spread new optimism, energy, and positive values that set into motion a profound renewal of the people of God. My personal preference to interpret verses 1 to 4 as a whole as words spoken by the Anointed One is a choice I have made as a reader of the text. As I have shown, such participation in the construction of the text is mandatory for every reader, since the text itself offers at least 3 different options concerning the length, form, and contents of the speech of the Anointed One. After this, verses 5 to 7 turn to the inhabitants of Zion, who are now directly addressed in second-person plural speech. At the same time, the use of consecutive perfect forms throughout this passage underlines the close context with the preceding speech of the Anointed One. Therefore, it does not seem obligatory at first to assume a new speaker. Also, the contents of these verses continue the reasoning of the preceding speech, insofar as the future happiness is further illustrated and contrasted with the former shame and disgrace. It is only in verses 8 and 9 that the voice of the Lord himself now speaks in first-person singular perspective and adds theological reasons why the preceding prophecies will come true in spite of the dark past. The final passage, verses 10 and 11, comprises another first singular speech, which reveals itself as Zion's thankful answer to the salvation promised by the Lord. The often unmarked changes between different speakers and topics require the continued participation of the text-immanent reader. I will try to further clarify and analyze the details and implications of this participation. One question, which I think is not easy to answer, is in how far the text-immanent reader is challenged by the text, as on the one hand, it certainly does invite him or her to identify with the fate of Zion, but on the other hand, there are also points that could trigger opposition. For example, there might certainly be readers who belong to the strangers that will serve as slaves in farming, according to verse 5, or who certainly do not belong to the afflicted ones,
Okay,
addressed in verse
Joachim,
1.
so
Yes, I'm nearly finished.
Yeah, if
Thank
you don't mind, could you
Yeah.
please conclude now? Yep.
Yes.
Thank you very
just
much.
One sentence. Okay, because they have a powerful position in post-exilic Jerusalem. So how about those who are in the powerful ones? Can we assume that the text consciously intends to provoke the opposition of such persons? Or is for them a way to be included into salvation? I hope the continuation of my work will bring forth some insights concerning these questions. And now I look forward to enter into a discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So now it's time to move on to the fourth session. Dr. Andrew Abernethy is ready for his presentation on how do worship and hymn involve the reader in the book of Isaiah. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Abernethy?
Good to see you all. Wow, what a joy to be with other people who study Isaiah. If you're looking, before I share my screen, if you look right over my shoulder, there's a picture on the wall of, that's the prophet Isaiah. Irving Amen is a Jewish American artist and was able to get a copy of that last year. So anyways, thought you all would appreciate that. I want to share my screen here and talk through kind of what I'm thinking. I love this idea of a short presentation conferences just as a workshop to get our thoughts going. I assume all of you can see this. So what I have decided to do as I've begun thinking about this paper is just to hone in on one hymn within the book and try to apply a reader-oriented approach to it and see what comes from it. So my research question is, what does a reader-oriented approach to Isaiah 12 reveal? And one of the things I think it shows is the value of a sequential intratextual reading via the implied reader, while also showcasing the need to include extra textual knowledge among the possibility conditions of the implied reader. And hopefully I'll tease that out here. In terms of methodology, I'm using Archibald's diagram from his reader-oriented unity of the book of Isaiah. And I guess he's revised some of his categories since then, so we may have to update this. Where we're looking at how a real reader or a real author is really inaccessible from the text, so we're dealing with an implied author who uses discoursers, narrators to convey what they're saying through characters. Then the implied reader is the one who is reading and detecting those. And then of course we move to the real reader who's outside of the text. One thing I found really useful in this diagram, which I don't think that some of the early users of the reader-oriented approach like Conrad and others quite grasp, was recognizing there are some possibility conditions that kind of temper who we're seeing as implied author, implied reader. For instance, if they know Hebrew, I mean, there's all these extra textual realities that are being tapped into amidst drawing upon an implied reader. The other person I'm drawing on is Wolfgang Iser, who was an early kind of reader response theorist. And what he really does is, I think, taps in well to what happens as you're reading something sequentially. You're both kind of, as you're reading, thinking retrospectively on how it's revising what you're reading in light of what's come before it, but you're also prospecting, you're anticipating what's to come. So I kind of tease those ideas out. So here's just some examples starting with going through verses 1 to 2 of this hymn. So if we're to apply this approach, we begin with Marta Bayom Hahu. In terms of an implied reader who's reading sequentially and part of an intratextual world, you're part of a vocatal sequence, which is extending back into chapter 11, where you're seeing all these wonderful anticipations of a new exodus of sorts. You're invited also into a temporality, Bayom Hahu, and so you're invited to think, what is Bayom Hahu? Well, when you read in light of what's come before it in chapters 1 to 11, and particularly the most recent ones, you're reading again in light of this time when a banner is going to be lifted up, and there's a sort of second exodus that's taking place. And then there's the question of the subject of Amarta. I think if you're reading this sequentially, the only time you've seen Amarta up to this point before this is when God is speaking to the prophet and saying, and you will say. And both of those instances are negative messages that the prophet is introducing in those contexts, talking about the nature of those messages. So the Amarta now, I think, is kind of introducing a juxtaposition, whereas Amarta before, the prophet was going to make the people's hearts heavy, unable to respond, whereas the prophet is bringing a word of critique to Ahaz, etc. Now there's this Amarta, there's going to be a new word, a more positive word, which the prophet is going to be saying. But as we move on to 1b, Odecha Adonai, there's nothing preceding it that has anticipated it. And this is where I think we move into the realm of needing to recognize the possibility conditions of an implied reader. It requires an implied reader who's familiar with the way Psalms work. Odecha is used only in the Psalms as well as here once in Isaiah. So it involves some sort of ability for an implied reader to detect that first person, Odecha Adonai. But at the same time, we're wondering who is the I speaker here. With Willem Buchen, I think suggests in a kind of intriguing way, I want to tease out more, is that the first person speaker up to this point has been Isaiah in the book. And so to imagine a prophetic persona of Isaiah being the one who's saying, I will give thanks to you, or O Adonai. So we move on to 1c. We get Kianafta Bi Yashov, Afecha Tenachemeni. And of course, this taps into the shuv and off language before, where there was anger that was not turning back in chapters 5, 9, and 10. But here, obviously, that reality is reversed. And then we have an introduction of something that's perspective, anticipating something later to come in the book with the use of Nahum. Now, moving on to verse 2, we begin with the statement of Hine El Yeshuati. This Yeshua is very much anticipatory language, although the name Yeshayahu is used before, and you'll have Ackroyd and others making a big suggesting that this is a way of writing Isaiah's name into this. I don't think that quite works, but it's more so anticipatory perspective of what is to come in the book, as well as the language of Batach, so language that's going to come later. But then again in 2b, you get that all of 2b, Kiozi, V'zimra Ya, Adonai, V'yihi li Shua, that's an exact quotation from the book of Exodus. There's nothing preceding this in Isaiah 1 to 12 that would have prepared a reader for this. So this again points us to more extra-textual knowledge or inter-textual knowledge that would at least require someone to be aware of that tradition to pick up on this. So the implied author seems to be assuming that an implied reader would pick up on this Exodus allusion. So anyways, this is just kind of what I'm thinking in terms of teasing out this balance between intra-textual knowledge and a sequential reading that is informing and illuminating how we read this hymn, but also appealing to the need for that extra textual knowledge that is kind of a plausibility condition as we're thinking about the implied reader. So that's where I'm at thinking at the moment, but would love your input and questions.
Okay, thank you for very illuminating presentation. Thank you very much. And now it's time to move on to the next session. Dr. Paul Kim is ready for his presentation on the Holy Seed for the readers in Isaiah. Vis-à-vis the readers in Ezra-Nehemiah. Right. So would you please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Kim?
Thank you so much again. And it feels like a feast, Isaiah 55 or 24 to 27. And Isaiah scholars, AKA nerds, but also the company of experts, teachers as well. I'm going to share screen, and it's gonna be, I have 10 minutes, so I will try my best. Just stop me when the time comes. Okay, so the key of this paper is regarding Holy Seed, as many talked about it, and more scholars are talking about it as I'm doing research. I'm like, oh my goodness, there is really nothing new under the sun. But the Holy Seed really occurs in the Hebrew Bible only 2 times. And what do we do about it? But I think when we look at it, it occurs in other places, not verbatim, but there are hints even within Isaiah. The evil-doing seed, and also Kedosh Israel, Holy One of Israel. What about the burning? Again, 1/10. Is there a pun with Ashur, Assyria? Will be burned by air again. And of course, the stump, different Hebrew word, but Isaiah 7 for the next chapter, Ahaz is chastised about those other kingdoms, small kingdoms, stumps, different words. And then, of course, the shoot and the stem of Jesse. So the verse 13b itself, scholars debate about redactional issues of authors, redactors, and audiences, readers. I'm mixing readers and audiences a little bit ambiguously, so help me. Verses 1 to 11 could be against all Israel, and then the 10th against Judah, or according to Sweeney or Roberts, then is re-burning. There is an element of punishment and then hope. Now, Williamson and his student, also important Isaiah scholar, Stromberg, they argue Trito-Isaianic connections, as we know. Scholars like Bustenai, Odette emphasizes Holy Seed might be related to holy people tradition in Exodus and many other parts from the Torah and other parts. And then because of Ezra 9 and Nehemiah, Amharites needs to be studied. Do they refer to indigenous people or the peoples of the whole earth, or the common people, the Minjung in Korean, or especially the time of Josiah, or do they refer to the Remainis, or those with unfaithfulness and abominations, especially these two words, toeva and ma'el, unfaithfulness, and then non-Israelites? Do they refer to the non-Judeans? And I think tremblers are also important. And scholars talked about those. Blenkinsop argues they might be the same group in both texts, both books, relatively. Although he argues it seems only Isaiah 1 and 65, 66 really connect to Ezra. Next question is chicken or egg question. Is it from Ezra to Isaiah, or is it from Isaiah to Ezra? Scholars like Sweeney, we learned that Ezra's reform and restoration program supported in Isaiah. Blenkinsop argues the early repatriates excitement, and then so the direction is the opposite, and then it switched to the critique against high priests, especially toward the Hellenistic time, late Persian time. So how do we reconceive Holy Seed? I'm still working on it, so help. The two are the same. They are the Gola returnees. Or in Isaiah, they're the remainees. And Ezra, they're the Gola returnees. Again, Williamson Stromberg would argue Isaiah picks up from them with echoes, whereas other scholars, E. Allen Jones especially, it's the opposite way. Ezra 9, we learned the Gola returnees from Babylon. But Isaiah 6, include both of them, according to Allen Jones's 2021 article, just came out on the topic of Holy Seed. After I submitted my abstract for this conference. Scholars, Brooke Schramm and others, it is not really tension between remainees and returnees. Again, Odette emphasizes the exclusive self-segregated community. Gary Knopper's exile was a curse, like Ezekiel, but again, through Ezekiel, it became a time of purification. Their readers, do they hear the same ideology, or do they hear opposite ideology? Pardon me for going really fast. The issue then also is assimilation against persistence or resistance or separation, preservation. Even within Ezra and Nehemiah, scholars debate, is it from Ezra to Nehemiah? Or is it from Nehemiah to Ezra? Then another issue is Ezra and Nehemiah is against the Persian setting, or should we read over against the Hellenistic setting? And then Chronicles. Many Chronicle scholars seem to present that it represents all 12 tribes as all Israel for the reunification. But Sesula argues Ezra 33:4 then, when all these leaders write to the same Persian kings, it's a missed opportunity to reconcile. That might be a little stretch, but Next question is, what was the nature of reform? Was it ethnic, social reform, or more economy-oriented, or religious, covenant and Sabbath, circumcision and whatnot? One thing I would like to venture is, what about political aspect? Again, the unfaithfulness and the sota ritual, that this war continues to occur. So we talk about parties, geography, temporal. Were the redactors and readers separated by parties or geography or temporal? We know that T. Meyer argued Tudor Isaiah and Trito Isaiah both were located in Yehud. Shalom Paul argues it might be the same author from Babylonian exile and then returned to Yehud. Gary Knopper's emphasized different time periods of exile and post-exile. Again, early post-exile, for the common good, or when you have a common enemy, you become allies. So amicable unity, and then all of a sudden, later on, the division. Nitsim Amzalat, other scholars recently argue Ezra and Nehemiah have different ideology. Nehemiah seems more tolerant, or vice versa. Excuse me, what intrigues me is Peter Venter and Donna Laird arguing for changing social context for Ezra and Nehemiah. So if I pick up, who are the readers? Were they against the setting of pro-Babylonian time or anti-Babylonian, which is pro-Persian, and then later on anti-Persian? In other words, when the empire fell, I think the shift must be very significant for when our mindset changes by choice or not. And then I'm amused by some puns. So in Isaiah 11, Shoresh, if it's Jesse's Shoresh, Shoresh sounds like Koresh. I know I'm thinking too much. Maybe I worked too much last night. But the Koresh, and then Kores, of course, Dubois Scoops Kores. The Holy One is not Shoresh or Koresh, it's Kodesh, Israel, as opposed to Cyrus. Isaiah 41, and then of course, Zerah Abraham, the seed of Abraham. Mark Brett especially argues for the holiness school, the priestly, beyond priestly holiness school, about the inclusive Abraham's descent in Isaiah 61. And then of course, in our passage is Zerah Kodesh. The shifted loyalty, why did Ezra declare separating those mixed people? I know this is stretch, but from different reception perspective, one reason I can think of is what was abomination during Japanese occupation? The greatest wrongdoing was not Japanese. They were bad in some sense. It was the internal Korean traders. That is, some of those key resistance leaders out of 33 writers of Declaration Independence movement, some of them shifted their loyalty. They did this in public, maybe by force or by their choice. The pre-Korean dynasty was so corrupt, the merge was inevitable. And the independence movement for which they were leaders was a riot. Let us, Korean young women, gather under the flag of Japanese in support of young men joining the battle. I am now convinced that Koreans must completely forget Koreanness. Our blood, flesh, and bones must become Japanese. Is there a sense of historical readers? And then also readers, are readers invited to think about the desired history, type of desired history? Were they dominant delegates from Persia, or were they small minority? Do we read as mimicry or hidden transcripts or polemics, or they were just pro-Persians or maybe pro-Babylonians, especially the mixed Amharites, the Remainis? Otherwise, how did the manuscripts scribes survive?
Okay, would you please conclude?
Yeah. Yes, the immediate readers, yes. But I'm thinking of Beijing Olympics and only few people are in the audience. But the rest of the world, there are invisible audiences. What about the potential readers? The social political occasion, dominant versus marginalized. The marginal group can be powerful minority. Again, fact or visions, ideals. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Porkin, for your very, very interesting and stimulating presentations. And now it's time to move on to the last session. Dr. Richard Bautch is ready for his paper on the Torah and the testimony in Isaiah and the book of Jubilee. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Bautch.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm honored to be part of this conference on the function of the reader in the book of Isaiah, and I want to thank Archibald and Sehoon for inviting me. In this session, we turn our attention to the book of Jubilees as well as Isaiah, and there's a handout. I put it in chat. It provides you with an outline and the texts. In the various Ethiopic manuscripts of Jubilees, the book's incipit is lengthier and likely a reflection of the full Hebrew title, no longer extant. James Vanderkam's translation reads, "These are the words regarding the divisions of the times of the law and of the testimony, of the events of the years, of the weeks of their jubilees throughout all the years of eternity, as he related them to Moses on Mount Sinai when he went up to receive the stone tablets." After the incipit or prologue, the phrase "according to the law and the testimony" recurs 6 times in Jubilee, and these are indicated on the handout, while the lexeme testimony is found some 25 times, also on the handout. Altogether, these citations form a leitmotif in Jubilees and raise the question of intent. What is meant by the idiom, the law and the testimony? What did it connote in Hebrew, which we know from 4Q 216 read, HaTorah be-HaTeudah? What did the ancient reader infer when reading this phrase, the law and the testimony? There's no clear consensus among the scholars of Jubilee, although many agree that the concept of the Torah and the testimony is significant to the overall stance of this book. It is noteworthy that Isaiah 8:16 similarly refers to the testimony and the Torah, bind up testimony, seal Torah among my disciples. 4 verses later, Isaiah refers to the Torah and the testimony in 8:20. And other portions of the book of Isaiah approximate the Jubilees author in his use of this distinctive collocation. While a clear literary relationship exists between Jubilees and the books of the Pentateuch, we should consider carefully the role Isaiah may have played in the formation of Jubilees. There have been previously studies that compared the last 2 chapters of Isaiah in Jubilees 23, which is a text replete with eschatological predictions, as in the book of Isaiah's finale. The work of George Nicholsburg has shed light on Jubilees' interpretive process around Isaiah 65 and 66. With this project, I'm suggesting we have the opportunity to learn more about the connection between the readers of Isaiah and readers of Jubilees by way of this expression, the Torah and the testimony. Through coordinated exegesis of the relevant Isaiah material and these aforementioned verses in Jubilees, I plan to explore these points of contact between the 2 texts. A leading question is whether vis-a-vis this phrase, the Torah and the testimony, there is shared meaning between Isaiah and Jubilees beyond that of a generic sort. Put differently, how does the idealized reader of Isaiah align with Jubilees' idealized reader of Torah? At the end of the process, I aim to indicate how the text of Isaiah or traditions associated with the prophet factor into the composition of Jubilees and the way in which it was read. So I want to begin in Jubilees with Jubilees 1 verses 4 through 6. This is point 2 on your outline. Here we have indication again of this phrase, the law and the testimony. It's part of the account of Moses on Mount Sinai. Since you have the text on the handout, I won't read it, but allow me to summarize. While on Mount Sinai, Moses receives both divine revelation and instruction. Revealed are temporal truths, the chronology of all the times, both of the law and the testimony. God instructs Moses to write this information in a book for a later time, after the present generation has turned evil and strayed from the covenant. Subsequently, descendants of the evildoers will read Moses' words and realize that God has not abandoned them despite their forebears' misdeeds. Rather, God has been faithful to the people. God has been with them. As Jubilees locates Moses on Mount Sinai to begin its narrative, the description discloses thematic elements that will recur with emphasis in the plot lines that follow in Jubilees. These elements are central to the message of Jubilees. First, Revelation in large part consists of the divisions of all the times. This type of temporal information is primary, not secondary. Second, the arc of time looks forward. In fact, it's eschatological, although there will come a point when people of the covenant will fall away into evil. A subsequent generation will, through the words given on Mount Sinai, understand that God has always remained faithful. And third, the words themselves are of God, and they have been told by God, such that the later generation will advance in their comprehension by realizing that their God has been and continues to be with them. Now let's turn to Isaiah. On the outline, this is point 3. And as I mentioned earlier, the key verse is going to be in Isaiah 8, verses 16, 17, and 18. A prima facie comparison of Jubilees 1, 4 through 6 with the first of these Isaiah texts that I intend to examine in chapter 8, it's quite revealing. The short unit in Isaiah begins with the mention of testimony and teaching, but it makes other relevant points as well. Simply read the translation, the English translation: bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. See, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. Torah here refers not to the Pentateuch or some precursor thereof, but rather to what the prophet Isaiah has taught to his disciples. That is, the teaching is circumscribed. The testimony, or teyudah, is different from the Torah, but we're not yet in a position to define it. An opening imperative to bind testimony and seal Torah, or teaching, stipulates my disciples as the party to whom these words are entrusted for a duration. That is, the prophet indicates a period of waiting in hope and trust, while presumably evildoers have their way and the prophet's oracles are disregarded. Isaiah's indirect evidence of malfeasance and worse extending into the future provides an initial parallel with the passage in Jubilees. In both situations, it is the carefully preserved teaching that sustains those who persevere during times of distress. God's words in Jubilees show the innocent offspring that they have not been abandoned, while Isaiah, along with his children, presumably the two sons referred to in 7:3 and 8:1, they become signs and portents for the good in Israel. This development we find in 8:18. Finally, Jubilees uses a theologumenon, God is with us, much like Isaiah does here in chapter 8 and elsewhere. Isaiah 8:8 and 8:10 rail against the Syro-Ephraimite coalition with oracles punctuated by God is with us. In both cases, Jubilees and Isaiah, God's abiding with the people gives hope and direction. The immediate future will bring trials, but the not too distant future will be marked by peace and prosperity. This is evident in Jubilees later in the Sinai account, where God discloses abundant peace, this is in chapter 1, verse 15, and transforms the people into a righteous plant in 1:16. So having established this initial comparison between Jubilees and Isaiah, I will, in the course of my future research, examine other passages in Jubilees that feature the Torah and the testimony. These include in chapter 1, verses 26 through 29, in chapter 2, 24 through 25, and verse 33, in chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. And these are indicated on your outline as 4.0. I've also shaded these. I've set them apart because we will not have time today to explore these verses. Rather, let me move to some preliminary conclusions. In the relevant portion of Jubilees, the most salient common denominator is time, understood not in a flat sense, but rather as an arc with heavenly origins that leads through creation to an interlude of sinfulness, but then extending to the eschaton. Isaiah 8:16 through 18 is similarly keyed to time in the future. Isaiah presumes that a portion of the prophet's addressees will stray from what he has taught, his Torah, so to speak. So while some disciples will remain with God and God with them. Isaiah imagines a temporal warp during which his disciples keep said teaching in anticipation of God's face shining on them once again. Isaiah's disciples keep a testimony, a teudah, that serves as a record of events. In the words of Hugh Williamson in his commentary on this verse, he writes, quote, "The sayings committed to writing would be preserved in order to eventually provide vindication of the prophet's position," end of quote. Something similar occurs in Jubilees, but in Jubilees, the teudah is more complex. It is legal documentation wherein heavenly pronouncements are underscored in order to establish liability on the part of those who abandon the divine teaching. Jubilees 1:8 reads, "They will turn to foreign gods, to ones that will not save them from any of their afflictions. Then this testimony will serve as evidence." Those bearing said witness are referred to as witnesses in Jubilees 1:12. When the transgressors of the law are called to account, the prosecution is supported by these textual witnesses such that the verdict against them is unimpeachable. Jubilee's situation in its broad outlines is sufficiently similar to that of Isaiah that James Vanderkam in his Hermeneia commentary describes the connection as follows. Isaiah 8:16 lies behind the situation presented in Jubilees 1, where the Lord discloses his message to Moses and commands him to record it so that it could offer testimony when in times to come the people would stray from the covenant. So as we all move forward with this exciting project, I will be focusing in a more intense and intentional way on this connection between Isaiah and Jubilees. And specifically, I'll be looking at another important passage in Isaiah, Isaiah 30:8-11. So I look forward to sharing with you that research as well as the final conclusions on the role of the reader, either at our next gathering or in the pages of our publication. Thank you so much.
Okay, Dr. Richard Bautch, thank you very much for very insightful presentation. So, okay, thank you very much. Now, I would like to conclude our conference today. So I think we had a very valuable and productive discussion today. So I hope we will continue our discussion tomorrow. Thank you very much for, especially thank you all presenters for your great and insightful presentation. And also thank you for joining us today. Thank you very much and have a great day.